Hey my nerds, and welcome back for another video. It's time for another evolution of, inspired by the release of Rings of Power. So we're going to be discussing the evolution of the iconic, the incredibly unassuming, the heroic, the Hobbit. Now, there has been a lot of hate for various aspects of the show, but I'm just not going to go into any of that. This is a good, clean, scientific analysis of a fantasy species. So let's get on with it. Starting with the basics, what are the hobbits? Creatures of Tolkien's Middle-earth, hobbits are between 2 and 4 feet tall. They have short legs and slightly pointed ears and furry feet with leathery soles. Their lifespan averages somewhere between 90 and 100 years, and they have a rather confusing history evolution-wise. Were you to line up all of the races of Middle-earth, you might be forgiven for thinking that the hobbits were maybe more similar to the dwarves. Compared to the dwarven race, the hobbits are a bit shorter and less stout and less stocky. Despite this, hobbits are said to be more closely related to men, far more so than even men are to dwarves or to elves. The assumption is that hobbits were made as part of the same act of creation as men were made, and it was from that point that they diverged evolutionary during the First Age. By the Second Age, though, what we see are 3 distinct forms of hobbits, and then by the Third Age, we only have the one. So to tackle this, we're going to break this evolutionary speculation down into 3 parts, with the first being the evolution of men to hobbits. The details of hobbit origins are a little grey, but it will have had to have happened in one of 3 ways. The first possibility is that there was some serious selective pressure allowing for 3 different hobbit races to evolve separately into the Fallowhides, the Harfoots, and the Stores. The second possibility is that it happened twice, with one common ancestor for 2 of those hobbit races. The third possibility is that it happened once, with all 3 hobbit races forming from that one species, that one common ancestor. One of these 3 options is far more likely than the others, and that's the last, with one hobbit species evolving from men and then that common ancestor diverging to form the 3 hobbit races. Why? Because of what we know happens later, i.e. these 3 hobbit races all interbreed to form the hobbits that we know from Lord of the Rings. This is a really important point in hobbit evolution, because for this to have happened, these 3 races must be similar enough, genetically speaking, to successfully breed and produce viable offsprings that can themselves then interbreed. So why does this make option 3 far more likely than the other 2? Because option 3 creates less genetic distance between these 3 races of hobbits, since their common ancestor is closer in evolutionary terms than those of the other possibilities. Is this a smoking gun? No, but it does make the third option more plausible as a theory. So until someone has a seance with Tolkien to find out from him, then this is the working theory that I'm just going to have to go with for now. So what would be involved in this evolution from men into hobbits? Well, first off, let's discuss the differences between the 2. The only real change that we can surmise from this intermediary species is the change in stature. Otherwise, the hobbit is very similar to man. I know, you're screaming at me about the hairy foot thing, but we'll get onto that later. Back onto this change in stature, there are lots of theories about the evolution of smaller stature, such as it's being linked to the environment by being more beneficial in colder climates because less heat is able to escape smaller bodies due to their smaller surface area to volume ratio. There's even theories that it might be because it reduces the risk of frostbite. So when you are having your seance with Tolkien, be sure to ask him if the hobbits happen to have evolved in a particularly cold region of Middle-earth. But there is a great deal of controversy over the evolution of pygmeism, with some attributing the evolution of smaller stature to being even a byproduct of selection for early reproductivity. So because of all of this controversy, we'll have to leave the evolution of men into hobbits as being plausible, but the exact evolutionary method for which it happened being up for debate. And this means I want to hear all of your theories in the chat for this one. Why did the hobbits evolve in the first place? With that done, now we get on to the second part of the hobbits' evolution, the emergence of these 3 hobbit races, the Stores, the Harfoots, and the Fallowhides. These hobbits all lived in different regions of the Vales of Anduin, and they didn't interbreed much for quite some time, which is important because That's what allowed these races to diverge and for these physical differences to form. The Harfoots were smaller, darker skinned, and had the hairy feet. They were foragers and excellent at hiding, while the Stores were heavier, broader, they had large hands and large feet, and they were the only hobbits to grow facial hair. They were also riverside fishermen, and their most infamous one was Smeagol, who later became Gollum. The Fallowhides, meanwhile, they were fair-skinned and had fair hair, and they never grew a beard. And of the three, they were the ones who were more scholarly in nature. So what can we surmise about the evolution of each? Harfoots first. Their smaller stature and darker skin is likely linked to their behaviour of hiding. Those who could hide better survived longer and were probably more attractive to the other Harfoots because of this skill. As for the hairy feet thing, possibly this is linked to helping them hide, get their feet out of sight. That or the Harfoots just loved themselves a partner with some hairy toes. Next, the Stores. Their larger hands and feet are likely due to where they lived, with larger hands and feet being great for swimming. Therefore, this trait probably evolved because it was linked to better survival prospects of the stronger swimmers. The Stores being heavier and broader might be linked to this too in terms of muscle mass. Just look at Michael Phelps. But I'm less certain of this one. As for their beards, well, that's probably a sexual selection thing. It usually is with beards. As for the Fallowhides, fair-skinned, fair-haired, not growing a beard, these are probably sexual selection traits as well, since they're more appearance-linked than linked to any particularly strong evolutionary factors. With that sorted, now we get on to the third part of the evolution, in the re-merging of these three hobbit races to form the hobbits that we know and love from Lord of the Rings. This interbreeding first took place between the Harfoots and the Fallowhides, with the Store genes joining the gene pool a few hundred years later. This period of mixing of the three took place over a long enough time period for the features to start merging, so you saw fair-haired hobbits with hairy toes and large-handed hobbits with no beards, but not long enough for these traits to become homogeneous and for some of the traits to be lost altogether. We know this because regional and familial variation still existed in the time of Lord of the Rings and was often alluded to in Tolkien, with his comments about the differences between different hobbit families. To be critical about this, I'm not sure if timing-wise this blending of the features quite lines up. I say this since the races will have been interbreeding for well over 1,000 years by the time Lord of the Rings begins, but this may be explained by the fact that the hobbits live longer and therefore breed more slowly, and there will have therefore been fewer generations during this time period of the mixing taking place. So I'm going to give that one a pass. And there we have it, the Hobbit, a race I'm fairly convinced by the evolutionary plausibility of, so nice job Tolkien, especially considering that you wrote this before we even discovered the DNA double helix, so cool. And so it is with great pride and honour that I place the Hobbit at the top of our table of evolutionary plausibility. Small and unassuming they may be, but plausible nonetheless. Alright my nerds, wishing you a fantastic week and be seeing you next time. Bye!